John Archibald Austin was born in the coastal village of Buckland just outside Dover in 1886. His father worked as a carpenter, and when John left school he began training to follow him into the family business. But his heart wasn't in it, and in 1906 he left home for London with aspirations to become an artist like his hero Aubrey Beardsley, who had died at the age of only 27 some 8 years earlier. Once in London, Austin enrolled at one of the city's art schools, but which one doesn't seem to be recorded, and the following years are similarly lacking in information, other than that he made friends with fellow artistically inclined bohemians Alan Odell, Austin Osman Spare and Harry Clarke. And in 1919 he married Ruby Thompson, who would also become his most frequent model. He briefly became a staff member of the Penny Illustrated paper, but there's no evidence of his actual work until 1921, when his first book illustrations were published in Ralph Holbrook Keane's The Little Ape and Other Stories. From the outset, his admiration for Beardsley's elegant pen and ink images was clear to see, and in the same year he also started having similar images published in the arts journal The Studio, most of which was black and white, although on occasion some of his images were reproduced in colour, in combination with his elegant line work, and on at least one occasion very successfully without it. He also contributed along with his fellow bohemians to the similar but short-lived Golden Hind Quarterly, edited by his friend Osman Spare. In 1922, his illustrated edition of a translation of Charles Perrault's 17th century fairy tales, with the title Tales of Past Times, was published. The illustrations were printed in colour, although in this instance it was applied mechanically to his monochrome originals with mixed success, and as many of them were printed quite small on the page, registration was rather hit and miss. Nevertheless, this highly decorative collection clearly indicated Austin's affinity for light fantasy subjects in general. But this book's success was immediately overshadowed, at least in creative terms, by the same year's edition of Shakespeare's tragedy Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Austin's work for this project was of an aesthetic quality rarely seen, and although the Beardsley influence remained, Austin's own graphic personality was no less present, and arguably more conventionally descriptive than that of his inspirational source. The visual evidence indicates that he was committed wholeheartedly to the portrayal of the tragic events of the play with great empathy, and it was undoubtedly an instance of a perfect pairing of writer and illustrator despite the centuries that separated them. It was also clear evidence that just like Beardsley, Austin's drawings had no need of colour to hold the reader's attention. In 1923 he returned to lighter, more contemporary fare with Francis Lawrence Bickley's frivolous tale The Adventures of Harlequin, which featured some black and white figure work of the characters involved and more flat-coloured pages printed using the same method as his earlier Perrault illustrations, with some similarly erratic registration. In that year he also illustrated the book Perfection, a translation of José María de Eca de Queiroz' book about Greek hero Odysseus, with a series of formally composed and highly plausible classically styled images printed in black and warm yellow. A year later, Rogues in Porcelain, a miscellany of 18th century poems, was published with yet more application of selective flat colour, although in this instance relatively successfully. And despite the use of colour, the finely inked images continued to resonate with the influence of Beardsley. In 1925, another limited palette series was created to illustrate the medieval Everyman and other plays, and his work for this publication showed signs of a certain stylistic restlessness. While quite a few of these images displayed similar descriptive naturalism to his work for Hamlet, others in the book were obviously exploring a more mannered geometric approach, which resonated with the principles of Art Deco. The shift was even more obvious in the same year's visualization of Daphnis and Chloe, written by Greek poet Longus in the 2nd century. These illustrations clearly showed just how much of an impact Art Deco was now exerting on his drawn style. The organic qualities of his earlier monochromes were gone in favour of a far more neoclassical but still graceful geometry possessed of considerable visual appeal. In 1925 he illustrated the novel Ixion in Heaven, originally written in 1832 by Benjamin Disraeli. And Austen's work for this project, rendered in line only and colour, mirrored the angular formal styling of Daphnis and Chloe, but added selective, tightly cross-hatched areas and similar controlled diagonal application of added colour. Although only a decade separated this and Hamlet, they were barely recognisable as the work of the same person. And in the same year he created this geometrically styled commercial poster using a daringly dissonant palette and no line work whatsoever. Austen was particularly prolific at this time, and in 1926 his illustrated edition of the satirical epic poem Don Juan, originally written by Lord Byron a century earlier, was published. All the images for this publication were monochrome only, but once more showcased his newfound highly stylised approach to anatomy and use of line drawing. The total effect was formal and generally emotionally unengaged, but nevertheless highly decorative and aesthetically considered. And for the same year's edition of Anatole France's The Gods Are Athirst, he created similarly styled illustrations featuring warm-mannered and formally posed figures, but which atypically featured the visually attractive addition of tonal washes of subdued colour, a technique he would return to in a couple of later projects. Laurence Sterne's book Tristram Shandy, published in 1927, was a fairly rare opportunity for Austen to allow more broad humour into his work, and although he rose to the challenge to an extent, and once more the images were aesthetically pleasing, his angular monochromes were not best suited to the bawdier elements of this work of fiction. Austen's illustrated edition of Gustave Flaubert's tragedy Madame Bovary, published in 1928, returned to the use of tonally painted illustrations, which were unfortunately printed as monochrome and consequently rather muddy in their reproduction. But fortunately the book also featured a series of particularly well executed spot illustrations and chapter headings, which were considerably more appealing. Wood engraving was certainly among Austen's methods, but whether these images were created that way I couldn't say for sure, although it is known that he was also fond of the use of scraperboard, which would have easily been able to produce similar results. 1928 also saw the publication of l'Abbé Prévost's Manon Lescaut, which featured a series of particularly delicate line and colour images which were among his most distinctive offerings. The colour was applied selectively as washes, leaving some areas remaining in fine line only, and all were extremely graceful in their execution. Again, I have no proof of it, but as a limited edition, it's more than possible they were printed as pochoir prints. Austen's distinctively formal angular hatching was on show again in his 1929 edition of Daniel Defoe's 18th century novel Moll Flanders. And in the same year he used it again for the more contemporary book Southwind, written by Norman Douglas a decade earlier. And in this instance he captured the more humorous elements of the narrative with great success. The third book of 1929 was a return to the work of Benjamin Disraeli, this time his novel The Infernal Marriage, with the same technique in both colour and monochrome. In 1930, following an unspecified illness, Austen and his wife left London for the coast at Kent. There he lived a more tranquil ruralist existence and even did some teaching at Canterbury School of Art. Much of the work I found from this time was created as limited edition wood engraved prints and lithographs, in both colour and monochrome, but what level of success he had with them I've been unable to discover. But there was illustration too, with a surprisingly tame edition of the erotic works of Pierre Loys, published in 1930, and he also worked on a series of wood engravings for an edition of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, which was for some reason never completed. And in 1932 he illustrated The Gypsy Dorelia, a play by Dorothy Una Ratcliffe. In 1933 he turned his attention to the work of Charles Dickens with the Pickwick Club, for which I could only find a few usable examples of his brightly coloured illustrations. And in 1935 he tackled David Copperfield, for which I could only find this isolated image. But mercifully there were plenty of examples of Austen's striking visualisation of Aristophanes the Frogs, originally written in 405 BC, which was published in 1937 by the Limited Editions Club of New York. And the images he created for this publication were all wood engravings, which deliberately used the limitations inherent in that process to make very satisfying and frequently comedic figure-based images. Shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, he and his wife moved to West Hythe in Kent, and in 1939 he returned to literary classics with Oliver Goldsmith's Vicar of Wakefield. And although the book contained a series of agreeable descriptive line-only spot illustrations, he also created full-page colour images which, however attractive, could be said to have been a little too light of touch for their own good. But this was not the case with the same year's illustrations for William Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, another for the Limited Editions Club, who by this point were almost solely responsible for keeping him in work. Again, he turned to wood engraving and created a series of very plausible medievalist scenes from this lesser-known play, and added a limited palette of overprinted woodblock colour to enhance the line-based images. In 1941 he illustrated Arnold Bennett's The Old Wives' Tale for the Limited Editions Club, using the strangely desaturated colour and fine line combination that dominated his later output. In 1943 he illustrated R.D. Blackmore's novel Lorna Doone with similarly static figure work, but rendered with more graphic impact using a textural subdued colour palette. It's recorded that by this point his health was not good and his income had dwindled considerably, but in 1944 he published a more than usually pale visualisation of Jane Austen's Persuasion, which also featured considerably more expressive line-only spot illustrations. Although this was his last published book, I did find this solitary wood engraving dated from 1948, which was also the year he died at his home in West Hythe at the age of only 62. Even during his lifetime, the absence of mainstream appeal in most of the books Austen illustrated and their limited edition status prevented him from achieving wider recognition. And so did the somewhat esoteric nature of much of his styling and determination to favour craft-based printing methods. Nevertheless, the distinctive narrative images he created during his fairly short career deserve to be remembered and given greater appreciation, and I'm grateful that I could scrape together just about enough of them to make this tribute.